Hi there, my name is Blue Asai, and I'm doing a panel on photography for ANW. Now to do photography, you don't need a big fancy camera like this R6 right here, which is a mirrorless camera, or this Canon 80D, which is a DSLR camera. You can do photography with even just your cell phone. Your cell phone these days are amazing for photography, and they even shoot in RAW. But if all you have today is just your camera phone, it is still a legit camera to go out and do photography with. For the first topic I want to go over is something that's true across the board for all artists, and that's finding a subject that you love to work with. For me, that was fursuits. I fell in love with fursuits, I got fursuits, and taking photos of fursuits is what has really pushed me to push myself and improve my photography. For you, it could be completely different, from flowers to taking photos of people on the streets, to portraits of people, to nature, to urban photography. There's a lot of subjects out there that you can do photography on, and just find what you click with and keep at it. Now, once you found your subject, you should get yourself a camera. Now again, your camera phone is still a valid camera, but I want to do this panel for the person who wants to go beyond your camera phone and really wants to get into photography. Now, there's a lot of good beginner level cameras out there. Now, what I'm filming this video on is the M6 Mark II. It is a budget camera from Canon. One of the big things that is special about getting an actual camera is the fact that you can change the lenses, because a key thing about photography is knowing what kind of lens to use for the situation. Now, one thing to talk about when you're buying your first camera is keep in mind that buying this camera usually means you are going to be locked into that brand for life. My first Canon camera I bought was I still have it, was an old Canon Rebel that took 35mm film. I got this when I was about 11 years old. That was probably a good 27 years ago. Loved it, and that's what got me into photography. Then I upgraded to the Canon 20D when I was about 18 years old. And this was my very first digital camera. And going digital saved me a lot of money on processing the film. After that, I got myself the Canon 70D in 2014. And then a few years back, I got myself the Canon 80D when I started taking photography more seriously in the furry fandom. And this is what I've been using primarily for most of my furry-con photos. So when you saw me going around fur cons, I was primarily taking photos with this camera, the 80D, and my 70D. It wasn't only till this year I upgraded to the Canon R6. And as you can see, for my very first camera I bought, I've been with the Canon brand ever since. So keep that in mind. When you buy your first camera, you're probably going to be sticking with that brand for life. Not often do people switch, but there's nothing wrong with Sony, there's nothing wrong with Nikon, there's nothing wrong with Fujifilm. They all make great cameras for you to use. Next, I will talk about 3 important functions when taking a photo. That is controlling your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO. Now, when you're starting out, you can shoot in auto mode, and there's nothing wrong with that. And even I shot in auto mode for most of my life. It wasn't until about 5 years ago that I finally made the switch to manual and really got the grasp of how to doing it. And when you shoot in manual, you have full control over your aperture, your ISO, and shutter speed. Your shutter speed is used to control the action and how much light also gets into your sensor. If you're shooting someone running down the street, someone riding their bicycle, or a race car, you want a real fast shutter speed, probably 500 to into the 2000ths of a second range. But that's also going to give you a very little light into your sensor. But if you're shooting something that is not high speed, you can crank it down to about 60th of a second, which is pretty common, to 125th of a second. And those are pretty standard shooting speeds when you're just shooting everyday things. And shooting lower than 60th of a second gets into interesting effects or into really low light situations. And when you want to shoot lower than 60th of a second, you're usually going into the special effect category. Like if you shoot the ocean for a few seconds on a tripod, you get that water smoothing effect. Or you can shoot for about 3 seconds exposure, and that's how they do those photos with light paintings. You keep your camera open for a long time and you can wave lights around in a very dark environment, and that's how people will create those really cool light painting effects in photos. Adjusting your ISO on the camera in the most basic way to explain it is boosting the sensitivity of the sensor. A higher ISO can see better in darkness, but that also creates a lot more noise. So like if you're at a fur con and you want to take pictures of the night rave dances, you want to boost your ISO to a higher setting rather than being outside in a sunny field. You usually want to keep your ISO as low as possible because the higher the ISO, it usually generates noise. But cameras these days are pretty good up into the few thousand range of ISOs. The last thing to talk about is the aperture. The aperture is an iris inside your lens, and every lens has a different aperture rating. This is a 1.2, this is a 2.8, and the one I'm filming with right now is a 4.0 aperture. So on your camera, you'll have a control for your aperture. The more you open it, the more light that gets let into the camera, but that also lowers your depth of field. The more you close the aperture, the less light that will be let into the photo, but that also makes your depth of field wider so you can get more in focus. Shooting with a low aperture or a higher aperture a lot of the times has to do with the artist's personal taste. If they want a lower depth of field or a greater depth of field, also has to do with how much light is in the scene. If there's not a lot of light, you do want to shoot as low as an aperture as possible. But if you're with a lot of light, you'll want to close the iris a bit so it's not as bright. So now that you know about the 3 basic functions of your camera, the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, the next question to ask is what kind of lens you want to get. Do you want a zoom lens or a prime lens? A prime lens is a lens that cannot zoom. It's at a fixed focal length. This one is a 35 and this one is an 85. Or a zoom lens, this one is a 24 to 70. You can see I can turn a dial on this and I can either get closer to the subject or further away from the subject, and this is a 70 to 200, and this means I can get really close to the subject. One of the key differences of a zoom versus a prime, primes are usually cheaper than their counterparts. So if you're being budget conscious, you want to get yourself a prime, and a good prime to start with is a 50 prime. But a zoom lens is also a little more versatile. You have a little bit more working range so that you don't have to work around, and usually a good starting point would be something like a 24 to 70. You got a little bit of a wide angle lens at 24, and you got a little bit of zoom at all up to 70. But again, a zoom usually, because they have more working parts, means that they're a little more expensive to get. So now you're ready to go out there and take photos. The next important thing you need to know about is, do I shoot in JPEG or RAW? And the number one I always say is shoot in RAW. But now with modern cameras, they can shoot both in RAW and JPEG, so you get the best of both worlds. What a JPEG photo is, when the camera takes a photo, it does the post-processing internally inside the camera. So it it will do what it thinks it looks best, adjusting the color, the contrast, the brightness, the white balance, and then save it for you, and then throw away all the other information. So when you take a raw photo with your camera, it is a photo that is what just the camera saw. So it does no processing with inside the body. So the photo will look a little muted in colors, a little flat, but it also saves a whole bunch of information that you can use in post-processing. The best way to think of it is a raw photo has like hundreds of hidden layers that you don't really see, but when you take it later into Photoshop, Photoshop knows how to tap into those hidden layers. So when you adjust the shadows bar, you can recover a lot of dark shadows, and the same vice versa. When you adjust the highlights bar in Photoshop, you can recover from overexposed areas a lot better. So that's why I always say shoot in RAW, because if you shoot in JPEG and you have a dark spot in the photo, you're not going to be able to really recover those shadows. Or an overexposed spot, you're not going to be really able to turn down the highlights and recover those overexposed sections. But in shooting in RAW, you can recover a photo that might not have been taken right in the field, but you can fix it in post. But not even fixing a photo, you just have a lot more editing power with RAW in Photoshop versus a JPEG. A JPEG is just a flat image that has very little post-processing power versus a RAW. So now let's jump into Photoshop, and I'll show you how to edit your RAW photo in Photoshop. Alright, so here we are at my computer, and we are going to edit one of these photos in Photoshop. Now these photos up here are raw photos. Let's see, let's grab this photo right here. Now you can either drag one, or you can drag them all at one at a time right into Photoshop. And what Photoshop does is when you drop a raw photo into here, it opens up a new window called Camera Raw. And Camera Raw is very similar to Lightroom, but I like the feature of Camera Raw because if I want to, I can click here and it will open it directly into Photoshop if I want to do further edits within the actual Photoshop software. Camera Raw basically lets you manipulate the raw image with all the basic edits. Your exposure, contrast, highlights, and so on. Curves, they're a little more advanced. Color grading, that's more advanced topics. Now if you were to drag and drop more than one raw photo, you can see them as a line on the left or on the bottom, and you'll be able to go just one at a time and edit all your raw photos. And so for today, we have our subject is Flick, and I drove actually 8 hours to do this photo shoot. It was such a beautiful location. It was completely worth it for this drive. We were in a field of flowers with these dead trees popping out everywhere, and it just made for some really great photography. Alright, so let's get started with the editing. Alright, let's go to the basic tab first. We have our temperature and our tint as the first two options. A lot of times I will leave these alone until I have gone through this list right here, because everything down here can also affect the colors. So I usually leave these alone unless I know it's a really overcast day and I will pump a little orange into it. But for now I leave them alone because I want to wait and see what my effects down here will do. So I usually start with adding some contrast. The highlight tool will find the brightest spots of your photos, and it can either make them brighter or tone them down, and I want to tone them down a bit. You can see right here, Flick's fur is now not as harsh. The shadow tool will find all the darker spots like here on the shirt, the face, and you can adjust it to be even darker or brighter. And I'm thinking for this photo, let's go around 40 brightness, because I don't want to adjust the background too much. So 40 is perfect. I don't usually mess with whites. I'm not really a fan of working with the whites. I always just never touch it. But with blacks, I usually go down a bit, and because it just makes the photo a little richer. when you just lower the blacks a bit. Our next three things are usually kind of like a combo. The texture, clarity, and dehaze. Each of these tools are kind of like a combination of two. Texture is kind of like clarity, and texture is kind of like a clarity and a sharpness combined, but I don't usually mess with clarity. It's not a tool I like to use really often. Or I don't usually mess with texture. It's not really a tool I use often. Clarity is kind of like a combination of sharpness and contrast. So you can see maximum clarity. I'll go up to contrast. Kind of same thing, it makes the photo a little darker. Clarity is up to the photographer. It's more of an artistic feel of what you want. You could up it a bit, or you could lower it a bit. It just depends on the mood you're in. For today, let's go -20 on clarity, and you can see it has softened flicks for a bit. Dehaze is a tool that will help get rid of haze in the photo, but you gotta be careful not to use it too much, otherwise it makes it just really darkens and oversaturates the photo. So I never really push it beyond 30 for dehaze. You can see we got a little, it helped clear up the background. Next is vibrance. Vibrance is kind of like blues and oranges. You can see it just really affects the blues and oranges. And you can kind of see it when I lowered it, it left some color still in the photo. It's something I usually go around 10 on vibrance, and then saturation, just push the slider so you can see what the effects do. Go lowers, or you want a black and white photo, go 0 on the saturation. But I don't really push the saturation that much either. Let's go with 10 on the saturation. For last on this page, I will go to details, and I will usually up the sharpening and noise reduction up a bit, and just helps make the photo a little more clear. So now with that, our basic, as I said, let's go back to the temperature after I have messed with all these tools right here. Looking over the photo, I don't think I need to mess with the temperature that much. As you can see, the color range is pretty good as is. Like if I were, usually I make it more orange, but that's adding way too much color to the photo. I don't want to push any more color into the photo. Yeah, I don't even think I want to use just a hair. So let's compare our photo, the original, to what it is now. So on the left we have our raw photo, which is very flat in colors, and the contrast and the lighting is just kind of off, because what the raw photo is, it just captures the moment. What it sees, it captures. But you have all that hidden data in the photo. On the right hand side, you can see we really brought the photo to life. But we can further enhance this photo using the brush tool up here. And we'll start with the flowers. For me right now, the flowers are very harsh, and I do want to tone down the harshness of the flowers. And next we will fix the shadows on the shoulders and on the face. We just want to make it a little brighter. And then third, we will work on the hills, because the hills are a little brown, and that's not very pleasing brown hills. Usually we want a little more life in the hills. And last, I'll talk about how to bring color back into the sky. So let's get this back to default. There we go. So let's bring our brush tool. Let's make sure it's set to default. There we go. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click my mouse, and then I can adjust the size of my brush. Alright, and let's turn on mask so I can see where I'm painting. And let's just get painting away. And it's okay to bleed over zones you don't want the mask to affect. For now, we're just doing a very rough painting. And there's two ways to make a mask. There's using the mask tool, or my more favorite way of doing it is turning the mask off and going down to saturation and making it black and white. So now I can really tell where it's being affected. Let's go back Yeah, let's go. Sometimes you can't tell on the dark spots. So let's go get rid of the mask on Flick. We don't want this to affect Flick. There we go. Oop, that's okay, you can always paint that back. We don't want it on the hills. Okay, let's paint back on the flowers. Oops. A little erasing. And we have this little tool right here called the Auto Mask. Let's see how well it does at erase. What Auto Mask does, it tries to stay on the subject you're painting using contrasting lines to tell where you're at. You see he's doing a pretty good job at staying just on the tree limb. No, not there. But it's okay. For things like this, it's okay if the mask is affecting small things, because it's not really going to be seen that well, because we're going to be making a very small adjustment. So let's bring back our color. And there's a few ways to get rid of harshness in bright zones. The obvious choice is you can lower the exposure. Second, because this is a very yellow-orange, you can go to the temperature and add a little blue. See, he's getting rid of, but it's still the yellows are still very bright, while it is killing some of the harshness. Let's reset that. We can try some contrasting. That didn't help. We can try the highlight. That didn't help either. Or we could try lowering the color. Kinda helps, but it also really flattens the color. I think my favorite was just lowering the exposure just a hair. Let's go -0.5. I can tell we missed some spots right there. Let's get those painted. Erase. Alright, let's take the mask off. That looks much better. That's definitely much better than before. So that is before. And then after, we definitely killed the harshness. Those flowers are no longer blinding us. Next, let's make a new brush. Let's reset our correction settings. And we want to bring some brightness back on our subject here. And to do that, we don't want to adjust the exposure, because the exposure will adjust everything. We just want the shadows to come up. So we're going to go down the shadows. Let's put it to 50. Let's start painting. There we go. There we go. Let's get just the shadows. It's going to pull up all the shadows on our subject. Now, that looks pretty good. Now I'll show you the difference. So we did 50 on shadow. I'll put that back to 0. And I'm going to do 0.5 on exposure. It still does good, but it also brightened the bright areas too, and we just don't want that. So, and you can see the difference. See, it makes it way too bright. But if we push shadows to max, it still stays. It doesn't really get overexposed on the white zones. But we only need 50, and that really has helped. Just it makes the face pop more and our subject pop more. So, come on, there we go. Before, and with making just the shadows pop. So you can see the power of the brush tool really helps gives you the localized edits. Next, I want to bring some life back into these hills. So let's go create a new brush, reset our local correction settings, and to do that, we want to bring this tint and bring it to the green section. And we're just going to paint away. Let's turn off that auto mask. And you can see it's bringing some life back into those mountains. get between, there we go. Let's turn on the mask. Oh, we got a bit of the sky. We don't want the sky. Always find it's always quick and easy. You just paint. Always be sloppy with the first adding and just take away. Let's turn on the mask. Let's see there, the mask is not helping too well right there. Right, oh, there's some sky. Let's turn that mask off. It's not really helping here. Get rid of we don't want it on the flowers. Now let's repaint again. Let's adjust our brush size. I'm holding down the right mouse and I can adjust that very quickly and easy. Let's go erase. Get off the cheeks. And I'll leave these trees alone. I don't think we're going to be able to tell unless you really look. See, as you can tell, yeah, you can't really tell the trees were affected by the green hue that well. And now let's adjust the green hue and just see how we go. There we go. Just a little. Just gives a little life to the mountains. Let's go. That is without the green hue and with. So as you can tell, it adds a little color, a little life to the mountains. And then last, let's work on the sky. It was a little bit cloudy that day, and we like blue skies more than white skies. White skies kind of make it seem overexposed. Okay, let's make a new brush. Reset our local tools, and then like we did with the mountains, we're just going to make this slider to the blue range, and we're just going to paint. Oop. Let's adjust our. Now let's turn on our mask and let's erase what we don't want to be blue. Go. And a little painting. Again, you don't always have to get so perfectly close because of the feather range of this tool does bleed out a bit, and it does affect, and it gets softer and softer as it gets near the edge of this painting tool. Erase. You can kind of see the effect because my mouse is nowhere near the borders, but it is getting that erased. Alright, let's turn the mask off. And let's play with the slider until we get it like how we like it. There's extreme. That's a little too extreme. Let's go -20. Okay, there's original with a little blue hint. So that you can see it adds a little color back to the sky. So now I think we have a finished photo. Let's go to original. Here we have the original on the left. As you can see, a raw photo is very flat in the colors and flat in the exposure. But through the magic of simple edits, we have brought the photo to life on the right-hand side. All right, I will meet you guys back in the studio. All right, so we are back from Photoshop, and I just have two last things I want to say before I wrap up this panel. I find this next one a very important factor. It's not only with photography, but with all art, is once you create your art, is make sure you share it. Post it on your Twitter, post it on your DeviantArt, post it on Flickr, share it to friends on Telegram, because if you don't share your art, why create art? The whole purpose of art is to be able to get out there. And again, I go back to just taking photos with your camera phone, or if you got a mirrorless camera, it doesn't matter. The big factor that makes a photographer is taking the photo and sharing it. Because without sharing with what you took, there's no point in taking a photo to begin with. And the last thing I want to share with you guys is that I'm basically a self-taught photographer. I took no classes, had no lessons from any teachers. I just got my very first camera when I was young, and I just experimented, and I just kept on experimenting, and I messed with the dials, and I just learned through experience of how the photos would come out, and I just kept improving and improving on what I gained through experimenting. And nowadays with the internet, you can learn quite a bit on photography, from the camera you want, to the lens you want, to how to compose a photo, how to use Photoshop. Any subject matter you want is on YouTube, and you can basically self-teach yourself on YouTube, through YouTube. And with that, that wraps up my photography panel for ANW. Thank you for watching, and bye.